And we're going till noon at the latest, right?
Yeah. So you get
Okay.
back to your meeting.
Yeah, we're ready to rock and roll. You let me know as soon as you get off. We can start.
Yeah, I'm just gonna introduce you, and then we're good to go.
Sounds
Let
good.
me unpause. I know how we're going to see everything. Um, Why can't I see the mouse? No problem. Hello, everyone. We're back. Sorry, you get to see me roll around the palatial studios that is in BC. So our next speaker is Alberto Lopez Pulido, who is an ethnic studies professor and founder of the Ethnic Studies Department at USD. He's also part of the Chicano Park Museum. He is the vice chair. He's part of the Chicano Park Steering Committee, and he's also part of and founder of the Turning Wheel Project. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over.
Thank you, Lindsay, and great to be here, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about where I'm at in my context because it'll speak a lot to what I want to share. I'm sitting in my truck on a cell phone, and because I'm at a meeting here in Kimball Park in National City. And I'll give you more context to that in a few minutes, but I actually was in a meeting and I had already this event on my agenda, but we had a situation that came up. So we called the meeting today. And so we started at 10, broke away here to be with you today. And I'm excited to do that. But I think it's also a nice opportunity to bring in part of what I'd like to share with you today. So I want to start off by telling everybody I'm a professor of ethnic studies. My apologies to everyone because my understanding of the academic and experiential worlds of journalism is very limited. And I wanted to share a little bit about my world, and hopefully we can find a convergence and hopefully some useful things to talk about and kind of talk about what I do in the field of ethnic studies and why, just again, with my limited background and understanding of what journalism is about in the world of journalism, see if there's a way that we could have some unique and interesting conversations with regards to like I would like to share. Let me say a little bit about myself. I grew up here in San Diego. I'm a border kid in the frontera de Tijuana y San Diego. I lived life both in San Diego and Tijuana with family in Tijuana. My medical doctor was in Tijuana. It was a very different world, pre 9/11, and so it influenced me a great deal. I went to school here. I did my undergraduate at the University of California, San Diego, and then I left San Diego for about 20 years because I went to graduate school at the University of Notre Dame, never having left Southern California. But that had a major impact on my life. And when I came back to San Diego, I came back to start an ethnic studies department. And I want to be clear that everybody understands it's not UCSD, but it's USD, which is a small Catholic university here in San Diego with very high tuition, predominantly white campus. And we teach pretty much privileged kids, but things are coming around, and we've had ethnic studies now going on 20 years. I'm really proud and excited about the work we've done with a full faculty and a full curriculum. So what I'd like to talk about is, if you see the title of my presentation, it says Ethnic Studies, Epistemologies, Subjectivity versus Objectivity. And I want to speak a little bit to this question of epistemologies and how we work with it in ethnic studies. And as fancy as a concept that might sound in the world of philosophy, it's actually a very straightforward idea, and I'll break that down for you. And when it comes to questions of subjectivity versus objectivity, this was sort of my hook in terms of trying to make a connection with the worlds you folks are part of and the work that you do, and my sort of pedestrian understanding, and seeing if you could assist me in developing my notions about this question, but at the same time bringing in what I wish to share with you today. And it's around, the notion of journalism and this sort of ethic of objectivity. And I share it with you because what you'll see in my discussion is ethnic studies is 360 degrees the opposite of that. Our work is purely subjective, and we speak to it, we claim it, we stand up against any kind of academic discipline that claims to be objective. We just don't do that work. And I can break that down for you as to why that is. So if you look at the bottom of this page, I have a quote, and I'm not going to lie to you, I took it straight off the computer. Took it straight off what came up on my search. And I have here, objectivity in journalism aims to help the audience make up their own mind about a story, providing the facts alone, and then letting audiences interpret those on their own. To maintain objectivity in journalism, journalists should present the facts, whether or not they like or agree with those facts. Objective reporting is meant to portray issues and events in a neutral and unbiased manner, regardless of the writer's opinion or personal beliefs. And I'd like to just explore that with you and maybe have you folks explore it amongst yourself. And again, I would very much appreciate being corrected or being critiqued if this is a very limited understanding of objectivity, or if it's biased, or if I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. It's all good. You know, we're here gathering, talking, and this is where I come at in terms of trying to enter this conversation. So if we go to the next slide. Let me tell you a little bit about my world and where I come from. The field of ethnic studies is a very recent discipline. I'm very excited, probably by journalists like yourself, that ethnic studies is really in the news these days. We're talking about ethnic studies being introduced into middle schools and high schools. In fact, one of my best friends is running the ethnic studies immersion in the San Diego Unified School District. And so it's become a big topic. I just supported a ethnic studies bill that's being brought before the legislature in the state of California, making it a requirement. And so we're really in vogue. And I have to tell you, having been teaching for 20 years here in San Diego in ethnic studies, I've been teaching much longer than that, but in San Diego, you know, I used to have classes with maybe 4 or 5 kids, and we were happy. And now my classes are oversubscribed. I have waiting lists. I have white kids wanting to learn about race. You know, everything radically changed with the killing of George Floyd, brother George Floyd. And so it's a good time for ethnic studies. It's a good time to begin to sort of deconstruct and speak about this notion of wokeness. It's a good time for talking about decolonial movements and questions around white supremacy. And so it's fascinating to me, having been doing this for a while, that this is a big conversation. And this slide here is just meant to give you a little bit of context. Over 50 years ago, San Francisco State University began to admit students of color to its campus. What was happening is we had mainly African-American students coming out of the civil rights movement, gaining access to San Francisco State. We had a liberal studies program at San Francisco State that was run by students. And what you had for the first time in higher ed in significant numbers were students of color attending universities. And so, as you can imagine, those students wanted a curriculum that made sense to them. If you were going to talk about American history, it wasn't going to be American history from the quote unquote white perspective, but it was going to be an American history that speaks to the voices of people of color, the oppressed, the enslaved, the exterminated, all those voices that had been silenced or had been erased or ignored. And this is a big conversation, and it's a big part of what I do. But my idea then, of course, is to tell that other story and to speak about that perspective from another point of view. And so you'll see the third bullet on this list, I'll jump to that one first, is we talk a lot about the master narrative and the counter narrative. The master narrative is a narrative that everybody hears. The master narrative is the one I see on the front page of the newspaper. It's the one that's always being told. It's the one that's driven by larger structures. And it's not one that is too critical. It's one that really embraces this point of view. And sort of as a quick footnote, this is the response from those families and communities that are very scared of the master narrative being challenged or being changed. I just saw Poway Unified was having a big demonstration earlier this week because of the fact that they were going to present critical race theory or critical race studies into their curriculum. So the predominantly white families were up in arms and they were scared because that master narrative could potentially be challenged and it could be changed. And so the counter narrative is to try to continually question and continually offer another perspective, another narrative. You know, my favorite topic around that, because I teach areas like in Latino studies, Chicano studies, Latinx studies, Chicanic studies, is how do we tell American history usually from a east to west perspective, right? That's how we understand our history. That's how we understand our society. And I always challenge my students to look at history from a south to north perspective. And quickly, if you were to look at that, first of all, America would not just be a country, it would be a continent. It would include people like Europeans, indigenous Mexican people from the middle America. It would just change the entire conversation. We have the 1619 Project, of course, that is also attempting to do the exact same thing. And my hat off to the New York Times for the very, very important work that they've done in that area, and very much about establishing a counter narrative. And so I think it's a wonderful project and a wonderful idea. Now, with regards to this concept of epistemology, tied to this concept of master narrative and counter narrative, is epistemology is basically how we know what we know. It's nothing more than that. And it speaks to the questions of truth. What is true? You know, what is it that makes a story true, and how is it that the storytelling that I'm giving is actually true? Or how is it that maybe I can tell that story from another perspective and present it in a way that actually then challenges that one narrative that everybody assumes is true? So how do we navigate that, and how do we provide a more critical analysis of a kind of topic? You know, I'm seeing, for example, today, a lot of stories around immigrants coming on these small boats and pangas, and that whole narrative is really blowing up in the media. And what I'm seeing that's very different, and this is just based on my pedestrian perspective, I don't have any analysis behind this, is that there seems to be more of a voice of care, like almost a voice of concern. It's not that these are quote unquote illegal aliens that are coming over and invading our country, but it seems to be a little different. And it's so interesting to me because it's happening on water. It certainly changes the narrative. And I can't even begin to fathom why that is. But if it's different from people who are on land, and they're attempting to address that, so that and trying to come to this nation, I don't know. Again, I'm just speaking. I'm just sort of riffing here, just trying to think of how you begin to see how these different stories are being told. Now, for us, and this is why it speaks to why I'm here sitting in my car right now and have my engine running, is I'm all about something called relevant education. And when the issue at San Francisco State began to grow, it turned into what was known as the Third World Strike. You had the San Francisco State campus closed down for many days, and it did not come back online until ethnic studies became a part of an academic curriculum at San Francisco State University. And so when you look at, let's say, sociology, when you look at geography, when you look at political science, how different might that be in terms of how my discipline became part of the academy? It came out of resistance, it came out of movement, it came to change the institution. Okay. And so my promise as an academic, in my attempt to do the best work I can, is I'm always wanting to bring up that counter narrative. And I'm always wanting to bring epistemologies that are broad in perspective. And so I'm very much about making that education relevant. So I'm sitting in my car because I'm working with a lowrider coalition here in National City. And what has happened in National City since 1982 is that it has been illegal to cruise your lowrider. Okay, it's a big discussion. We don't have a time to go on into that whole discussion, but that there is a movement afoot here, and I'll explain to you why this has come forward, to begin to change and to get rid of the anti-cruising ordinance. What are we talking about there? Master counter narrative. The master narrative is lowriders, Chicanos are deviants, are gangbangers, are drive-by shooters, and therefore then that's that sort of narrative that makes it illegal to drive your vehicle up and down Highland Avenue. Highland Avenue being the historic space for lowriding. And so there is now a movement afoot, a resistance movement afoot to try to change that. And so I'm sitting in my car because I'm in that meeting right now. I'm the educational consultant to many lowriders here that are attempting to bring that kind of change. And so finally getting back to the point that I started off with, I'm very subjective in my analysis. I'm not going to present an objective story. I don't have any interest in doing that. And you see the reason being because our stories have not been told. Our perspective, our framework doesn't exist in that larger canon. It's not till we begin to decolonize stories. It's not based until we begin to change stories that we begin to liberate communities. And what I'm hearing for the first time in bigger conversations, we're talking about structural change. And that to me is exciting. That to me is fascinating. And how do we then begin to change structures? It's a hell of a lot of work, but people are saying that for the first time. Where before I've never heard anything to be about changes in structures. It's always been about changing individuals. And so one of the biggest challenges that we're facing here in National City, and I should say more specifically the United Lowrider Coalition is facing, is how to work with law enforcement. How do you deal with folks who basically tell you you can't cruise? And how do you come to an agreement with somebody that doesn't want you to do what you want to do? It's a very, very difficult issue. And then we enter into the world of contradictions with regards to the work that we're trying to do. So I hope you can appreciate a little bit of what I'm trying to say here in this larger perspective around how you do work from a subjective perspective. You're telling stories, you're telling narratives from voices that have usually been erased or have not been told. And it's only been recently that we're starting to see perspectives and points of views changing. It's just a very, very important topic. I would refer to a writer by the name of Levin Morales, who makes reference to the fact that storytellers from these communities are all about healing communities. They're all about transforming communities. And she speaks about it as a Puerto Rican scholar. She speaks about it as curanderas, that storytellers have to be healers for communities because of so much pain and so much conflict that's in there. And she speaks to the stories and the words and the narratives as remedios, as remedies for attempting to address these issues. Next slide. So here's a little bit more context for you. This is not the official sign that's here in National City, but it's the one I could find online. Our sign is on Highland Avenue. It's near the Walmart on there, and it's also near a restaurant called La Maze. And you'll find these that basically say, you cannot cruise your vehicle on Highland Avenue. And what's interesting about this one, because it's for City of Long Beach, it says if you go 3 times past some point within 4 hours, you're cruising. And of course, it's very subjective because it depends on who's driving the vehicle. It depends what kind of vehicle they're driving. I'm assuming if you're a very affluent person in a really nice car and you happen to be lost and you're going back and forth down the street, I doubt you're going to be pulled over. Okay. But if you're cruising your lowrider, you're listening to some good music and you're, going up and down the street, that's cruising, you get pulled over, your car will be impounded, and you may be subject to arrest. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to deal with this because in the end, it comes down to the police officer. I would make the case that lowriding is considered art that transcends space and time. And that's why lowriding is such a challenge for the dominant culture, because it's not something that's permanent, but it's always something in motion. And you use highways and roads by way to express yourself. And that's really challenging to the dominant culture because their whole issue is about law and order and control. So how do you challenge that, or how do you maintain that, still looking at this very vibrant expression of culture? And you're using a vehicle, a car, to do those kind of issues. And if you were here with me, you would see many of the lowriders that are parked out in the parking lot that are expressions of culture, expressions of traditions, expressions of family, about building community. And yet I'm being told that the one thing that I want to do with my vehicle, I cannot do here in this community. It's all about car customizing, about modifying your vehicle that after World War II really blew up in this country, especially in Southern California, where you have so many roads and you have so many ways to get access to cars. For the dominant culture, it was hot rods. It was what you call muscle cars, mean cars, driving your vehicle and going fast. And, those of you who are old enough to remember a film, American Graffiti, would be a very good example of what I'm making reference to. In the lowrider community, it's the opposite, low and slow. And quite honestly, in my many years of studying the lowrider community, low and slow is a good way to live. It's a good way as a philosophy of life. It's a good thing to do. It's almost a way to live a very different experience. And so that's also a concern to law enforcement, because if you're low and slow, number one, you're too low to the ground, so that's against the law. And number two, if you're going too slow, then you're holding up traffic. And so it becomes a big issue. It really comes to a crescendo in 1992 when Highland Avenue is shut down. You have the anti-cruising ordinance that comes forward, and here we are in 2021 attempting to repeal that. If any of you are interested, I have made a documentary by the name of Everything Comes from the Streets. We spent a lot of time talking about this issue here in National City. It's all about low riding. I'm very proud of the documentary because it won a few awards. We took it to Europe, and it was all about these stories. But again, how did we put that story together? We put it together with the voices of the community. It goes back to the question of relevant education, and it goes back to the question of subjectivity, because these were stories that were never being told and stories that were never being heard. Next slide. Just a little bit of documentation here. Once law enforcement came forward and the police came forward, then it's all about shutting down the low riding scene. You saw that places, community organizations like the Committee on Chicano Rights here in National City began to organize, because it was many attempts to bring low riding back to the streets. And all the many attempts that have been fostered in the past have not been successful. And so there's, once again, we have a specific situation that triggered this, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I just want to talk about the challenge now that you see, like, what is the role of the police? What is the role of law enforcement in these days and ages of defunding police? How can low riding be incorporated into a community that is against it, and law enforcement is used as a way to target it? How can the law enforcement community do their work without a law enforcement agenda? Is that possible? How can they just simply be one with community, but not have to be carrying the badge and the gun, and can therefore then be an extension of what the low-riding community is? It's a real challenge, and it's really, really hard. And so therefore then this voice of authority and this narrative authority is the one that sort of, overrides everything else. And so it's a very, very, very difficult situation that we find ourselves in. And how do you then navigate that? And, National City is a smaller city within the larger city of San Diego. Not to mention, with the exception of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the past few years, cruising is illegal anywhere in the United States. When we took our film on the road, we would be in San Francisco, we would be in San Jose, we would be in El Paso, Texas, we would be in Taos, New Mexico. And what was the first thing we were told? We can't cruise here. Can you help us get cruising back? Because we want to cruise. Illegal throughout the United States. Is it racial profiling? Hell yes. Is it racist? Yes. And it becomes an issue, then how do you begin to dismantle it? And I also think then, for the sake of our discussion today, how do you report it? How do you talk about it? How do you present it? How do you work with it? And by the way, there was a good story that was done in last Sunday's paper. A shout out to Tammy Murga, who wrote a wonderful story in Sunday's UT around that. Next slide. This is what started it all. The United Lowrider Coalition came forward because a woman by the name of Marisa Rosales, who's a member of the Duke Kart Club, resident of National City, decided that she was going to have some pop-up cruises, not on Highland Avenue, but on National Avenue. Marisa is a licensed social worker. She works for the county of San Diego. She suffers from PTSD, and she feels that low riding is therapy for her. That's why she cruises. So cruising is a very personal thing. Cruising, again, is not a profile thing. It's not a gangbanging thing. It's not a, whatever the negative, deviant category you want to create. It's very personal. It's about me, about my story, about what we have to offer. And I can share with you 6 or 7 other stories by the lowrider community that speak very much about the personal and about that experience. So what she did is, these were the posts that were placed on Instagram and brought people out. They did it 3 times, and the 3rd time, National City came out in full force with badges, with motorcycles, writing up tickets, and impounding vehicles, and that's when things came to a head. So that's then what brought forward people coming together, organizing, and attempting to repeal the cruising ordinance. We've gone before the city council. We're continuing to have meetings with an organization that I think is called the Police Community Relations Commission for the City of National City, and we continue to work on this story. There's a quote from Maritza that came part of her testimony and part of the conversations that we had. And so this just gives you a little bit of context and a little bit of perspective. All right, so what I'd like to do with your help, Lindsay, is I just wanted to throw out some questions. I think this could lead to a breakout. Maybe people can reflect on this, think about it in terms of everything that we're talking about, and then maybe spend a few minutes seeing what people reporting back and seeing what they think. So if we could go to the last slide. So these are my kind of questions and my thoughts I had. You're more than welcome to add more to it, but just kind of as a way to, this is a very abbreviated presentation. I'm just hitting on a couple of topics. There's way more things we could address, but within my time frame, this is what I'm looking at. But you're more than welcome to bring up other topics and other issues that maybe I haven't covered, or that makes you think about other things, or you have questions. And you'll see that all of these questions, I want to tie them to the very last bullet. In your discussion, incorporate low riding as a case study in addressing any of the 3 aforementioned questions. So what are the questions? Question number 1, how important is the ethic of objectivity in journalism and news reporting? Number 2, is it possible to tell a story from a subjective perspective that represents good journalism? And then number 3, one of the assumptions in an intersubjective narrative, that's what we would do in ethnic studies, is to produce counter narratives that directly challenge master narratives that reinforce the status quo. An intersubjective narrative strives to support community-based, anti-colonial, and liberatory storytelling and organizing. Basically, just very, different in its analysis, and one that moves towards social change. And so then my question is, does such a perspective have a role in journalism and news reporting? So those are my thoughts. Lindsay, I guess I can let you take over to figure out how we put people into breakouts, and then we can come back, I don't know, in 10 minutes and see what people came up with. Does that work?